relationship with Mr. Salmon was something that was not going to cease. She went over to Australia with Keith and attempted to revive the marriage, which was failing, and it didn't work. And both of them recognized it. And it was really at that stage, although Lorna and Mr. Salmon had been together before, on her return from Australia, that sadly was the beginning of the end of Rena Salmon's marriage.
Lorna Stewart had returned to Britain from Australia, her marriage over for good. Her affair with Paul Salmon was back on. Rena Salmon, once again, was the last to know.
Paul had gone shooting with my son, and he got home, and he was just really odd, and said that he really hated me, that it was my fault that he couldn't be with her. I was in bits and just said, so there isn't much point me being alive if that's how you feel.
Rena locked herself in her car with a bottle of port, an old present from Lorna and Keith, and a whole bottle of her prescription morphine. She downed both bottles.
And all the time I kept thinking, my God, he really doesn't love me. My God, he really wants this. So I drove off. I drove through the village, past Keith and Lorna's house, and I thought, and you can have this back as well. Threw the bottle of port through the window and then carried off. The next thing I knew, I woke up in hospital. Paul arrived and I said, well, how did I get home? He said, you didn't. He said, I came looking for you. He'd got me home, dragged me onto the sofa. He said, and he sat and watched me.
She asserted that Paul Salmon had deliberately not called an ambulance, hoping that she would die. He denied that utterly, and indeed it was he who called the ambulance, though she accused him of calling it deliberately late.
Painfully aware that her husband no longer loved her, and now facing divorce, Rena Salmon turned on the woman she blamed for wrecking her marriage.
Paul rang. It's a lovely day, it's really sun shining. When you get back, we'll go out for a drive. I said, okay, where are you? He said, oh, it doesn't matter. I said, well, it does, where are you? He said, I'll be home soon, just give us a break. I said, okay, put the phone down. And it just went through my head. He's at Lorna's.
When she went round to Lorna's home, banged on the door for so long and shouting so loud that Lorna was able to ring Paul Salmon to say what was going on.
She opened the door. She stood there, and I said, how could you do it again? Why? What makes you think you have the right to treat me like this after everything? And she says, because I can look at you. You're fat, you're ugly, and you're boring.
Rena Salmon said that Lorna called her fat, boring, and ugly. Insofar as one can pass any personal judgment about that, it didn't fit with Lorna's personality to have said that. She, it seemed from all the evidence, did feel guilty about her relationship with Paul, insofar as the effect it was having on Rena.
So the first time in my life, I struck another human being, and I slapped her as hard as I could. And right then and then, I believed I had the right to do it. She grabbed all of my hair and started hitting me back, which was a shock, has to be said, because I honestly believed I had the right to hit her and she should have just accepted it.
The two women heard and I think seen to be rolling around on the floor in a fight, and in fact it was still going on by the time Paul Salmon was able to get to Lorna's house.
The neighbour says, take Rena home. She's hysterical. He said, no. He said, why would I want to be with her when I've got her?
The police had to get involved in the fight that there'd been between Rena and Lorna, which Rena had started. And not only was Rena Salmon cautioned for that assault, it was later discovered that she had actually scratched the word whore over Lorna's Saab before she'd left the area.
I had heard messages that she left on the answer machine, just screaming at Lorna and so forth, and Lorna came in and said that she'd etched whore into her car and that she'd actually assaulted her at her house.
The escalation, or if not escalation, certainly the continuance of violence, the throwing of a bottle through Lorna's front window and the sending of insulting messages to her, certainly seems to have been fueled and heightened by the divorce proceedings that really got underway in the spring of 2002. And the details about access, maintenance and the like certainly seem to have increased Rena Salmon's anger towards both Lorna and Paul.
She seemed quite reserved about the whole thing. She never really said too much about it. She didn't seem angry about it, but she didn't particularly seem terrified, as you would expect. And I did say to Lorna, why are you doing this? Why are you getting involved with a man that clearly has a wife that feels this way? She didn't really answer. I mean, Lorna was her own person. She decided that that's who she wanted to be with, so I don't think anybody could have said anything to her to dissuade her at that point.
Lorna Stewart dismissed the concerns of her friends. She was in love with Paul Salmon. But his wife, Rena Salmon, was becoming more desperate.
Where somebody is not by nature aggressive, at least one perfectly plausible explanation for that behaviour is that they are unwell. She became desperate, if you like, in ordinary terms, but also started to develop symptoms of depressive illness, but in a very fluctuating way. So when there was a sign that things might be all right, she'd feel better, and when it looked as though things wouldn't be all right, she'd start to experience depressive symptoms again. I think by the time it got to the second attempt at self-harm, I think that was probably an attempted suicide as such.
I sat under the tree in the car, waiting. But then I thought, I said goodbye to the kids.
Paul was taking the two children down to Dorset to be with Lorna for a while, for he had joint custody of the children and had access to them. And when they were on their way, the children were sent a text message by their mother.
So I texted them a message just to say that I couldn't live without Daddy, and I was sorry, but I'd watch over him from heaven, and that I loved him.
That obviously caused Paul Salmon to do a literal U-turn and go straight back to Hungerford on the common where she said she was. And she, of course, recovered from that particular threat. Any person who's been unfortunate enough to have to deal with a person threatening suicide reaches the stage where they cannot act in subservience to that threat. Otherwise, they no longer control their own actions. The person threatening the suicide exerts absolute control. And particularly in the breakup of a relationship such as there was with the Salmons, it was not fair to the children. It wasn't fair even to Mr. Salmon, committing the adultery as he was, to have his every action controlled by the threat from Rena that she would take her life.
In her defence, Rena Salmon maintained that she'd been continually taunted by Paul about his love affair with Lorna.
I phoned him up and I said, I'm taking the kids to Lyme Regis. He goes, no, you're not. I said, oh, yes, I am. And I put the phone down, so I text Lorna to say, please don't use the house in Lyme Regis this weekend. I intend to be there with my kids. And he phoned me back. And he said, to tell you what, he said, you go to the house in Lyme Regis. He said, because I can shag Lorna just as easily in our bed as I can at Lyme Regis. And I lost it. It's like, you bring her anywhere near my house and I'll kill her. But it's not meant.
Rena Salmon, a mother of two living in Berkshire, is being tormented by her husband's continuing affair with the woman who used to be her best friend. In July 2002, believing she cannot live without her husband, she resolves to take her most drastic action yet.
As her depression got worse, and as that was linked with emotional insecurity because she'd lost the source of her security, which was her husband, she probably came to depend emotionally on her children, and that was, if you like, something of role reversal, whereas normally the parent who's the robust, strong person and the child depends upon them. I suspect it became more a mutual relationship, if you like.
After my second attempt, the kids asked me to promise never to do it again because they loved me and they didn't want to be left without me. So I promised, but I couldn't keep the promise. So I sat them down and I told them that I couldn't keep the promise, and I wanted them to let me off. So they said, don't leave us behind. So I said, okay, I'll take you with me, but I'm not staying. My daughter went to her dad's overnight. She told Daddy. He thought I was a risk, not just to him and Lorna, but to my children, and that he feared for their safety, and that he was contacting social services. But he didn't. But he knew. He knew I'd take my babies with me.
She, so to speak, made a pact with her children that they would all kill themselves with her morphine. Now, you can't make a pact with children of that age. Essentially, what you're talking about is killing your children.
In August 2002, Paul and Rena Salmon decided to go on holiday together with their children to Florida. But any hopes Rena had that this would lead to a reconciliation was short-lived. Paul told her he wanted to marry Lorna Stewart.
She seemed to be really in love with him. I think the fact that he was in control of the situation, as opposed to when she was married to Keith, he was the house husband, she was the driver of the business, of the relationship. Her feelings towards Paul must have been extremely strong for her to leave her children in Australia and come back to him. I couldn't see what the attraction was, because she didn't seem to match up to him. But she must have done, because she must have felt something very strong about him to leave her children in the first place.
Lorna Stewart had returned not just to a relationship fraught with problems, but also to potential financial ruin. A fire had destroyed her beauty salon in Chiswick, though its cause was unknown. Restarting the business wasn't going to be easy.
The business was completely out of action because there was no treatment rooms. All the girls had to be laid off, so they'd all lost their jobs, and Lorna was trying to re-establish the business. I subsequently found out that she was massively underinsured, so everything was going to have to be done on a real shoestring. And that was an incredible strain, because there wasn't enough money to get the rooms redone and to get the equipment in that she needed and to get all the stock that she wanted back in.
Once the marriage had broken down completely and Mr. Salmon was living with Lorna and they had set up house together, Rena was looking after the children. She was finding existing by herself with the children an increasing strain.
They pushed me to the point I had nowhere else to go. I'm their mum. It's up to me to provide for them. It's up to me to let them have the lives they're meant to have and become the people they're meant to be. And I couldn't do it by staying alive. If I died, they could.
She was on large quantities of medication, but she was also very focused, no doubt focused by her anger towards both Lorna and Paul. And it culminated with her getting a contractor to open the gun safe at her and Paul's home.
All the gold coins that Paul and I had bought over the years and my jewellery were all locked in the gun cabinet along with some paperwork. And I'd asked him on numerous occasions if he would open them up so that I could get them valued for the maintenance.
And opened it indeed on the pretext given to the engineer that her husband was dead and that she wasn't able to open the gun safe following his death and wanted to get some coins out of the gun safe.
I knew the guns were there, and part of my plan was to kill myself. So not only would I have the jewellery available and the gold coins for the kids, but I then had a way of making sure that this time when I tried to kill myself, I succeeded.
So she then had the weapon, she had the ammunition, and this was just days, 4 days, I think, before the shooting itself. It was, again, a build-up, but it was a build-up, even if it was fueled by rage, about which the Crown's case was, and the jury seemed to have accepted. She was really quite calculating.
At the time that she unlocked the gun cabinet, I suspect that she had all sorts of emotions, extreme emotions, going through her head, as she probably had right up to the time when she killed the victim. So she would have had feelings of towards suicide for herself or towards homicide to somebody else. but you can't say for definite, this is what she